A shift in dietary guidelines was implemented across public institutions. It entered the routine through revised charts and new labels on food. The measurable effects on population health emerged much later. This was not an isolated event in how systems define what is good. By the early 1980s, entire categories of food had been reclassified. Fat became a threat. Whole milk became a risk. Butter was replaced not because new evidence had been gathered over generations, but because committees met, voted, and recommendations changed. The speed at which this happened wasn't unusual at the time. It felt like progress. The language used was confident. Medical organizations issued statements. Government agencies updated their charts. Grocery stores rearranged their shelves. What had been considered normal one year was now presented as dangerous the next. And because the message came from institutions people had been taught to trust, most didn't ask how the conclusion had been reached or whether the science was actually settled. Fat was removed from milk, from yogurt, from cheese. What replaced it wasn't always disclosed with the same clarity. Sugar was added to improve taste. Starches were adjusted to maintain texture. The ingredient lists grew longer, but the front of the package now carried a label that said low fat or heart healthy. That label became more visible than anything else. Children growing up during this period were taught these principles in school. Nutrition posters appeared in classrooms. The food pyramid was printed in textbooks. An entire generation learned that fat was bad, that grains should form the base of every meal, that eating less fat meant being healthier. The message was repeated so often that it became background knowledge, the kind of thing people didn't question because it seemed universally accepted. But the research that led to these guidelines wasn't as clear as the messaging suggested. Some studies showed correlations, others didn't. Debates existed within the scientific community, but those debates weren't part of the public conversation. What reached most people was the final recommendation, delivered with certainty. The shift wasn't just about what people were told to eat. It was about what became available. Food manufacturers reformulated their products to align with the new guidelines. Low-fat versions of nearly everything appeared on shelves. Ice cream, cookies, salad dressings, snack foods, all were redesigned. The assumption was that removing fat would make them healthier. What actually happened was more complex. When fat was removed, flavor was lost. To compensate, sugar was increased. Carbohydrates were adjusted. New ingredients were introduced to mimic the texture and mouthfeel that fat had provided. The result was a product that technically met the new definition of healthy, but wasn't necessarily closer to what humans had eaten for most of history. Most people didn't notice this at the time. The focus was on the label. If it said low fat, it was assumed to be better. The idea that processed low-fat food might be worse than whole food with natural fat content wasn't part of the mainstream conversation. It wasn't discussed openly in the way that fat itself had been discussed. This wasn't because people were careless, it was because the system was designed to create clarity, not to accommodate uncertainty. Guidelines needed to be simple enough to be followed by millions of people. Nuance didn't fit on a poster. Complexity didn't translate into policy. So the message was simplified, and the simplification became the truth. The real impact appeared years later. Children who grew up eating low-fat diets became adults. Obesity rates didn't decline, they rose. Diabetes became more common, not less. Heart disease, the condition that fat had been blamed for, didn't decrease in the way that had been predicted. By the time these patterns became visible, the habits were already set. The food environment had been restructured. People had spent decades being told that fat was the problem, and changing that message would require admitting that the previous one had been, at best, incomplete. But admitting that would mean questioning the institutions that had issued the guidelines in the first place. It would mean acknowledging that policy had been set before the science was certain. And that kind of acknowledgement didn't happen quickly, if it happened at all. The fat-low era wasn't the result of a conspiracy. It was the result of a system that prioritized clear messaging over scientific caution. Committees needed to produce guidelines. Industries needed to respond to those guidelines. Schools needed to teach something consistent. The public needed to be told what to do. And so a decision was made, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because a decision was required. The people who set those guidelines weren't trying to cause harm. They believed they were acting on the best available information. But the best available information was incomplete, and the certainty with which it was presented didn't reflect the uncertainty that still existed within the research itself. What followed wasn't just a dietary shift, it was a behavioral one. People began to see food through the lens of nutrients, not ingredients. They looked for labels, not sources. They counted grams of fat, not quality of food. The focus shifted from eating real food to eating food that met certain numerical criteria. This change wasn't accidental. It was the logical outcome of a system that reduced nutrition to guidelines that could be printed, posted, and followed at scale. But scale doesn't account for individuality. It doesn't account for context. It doesn't account for the fact that human bodies don't all respond the same way to the same inputs. The guidelines assumed a universal truth. They assumed that if fat was bad for some, it was bad for all. They assumed that if reducing fat helped in some cases, it would help in every case. That assumption wasn't based on long-term observation. It was based on models, on projections, on studies that often didn't last more than a few years. By the time longer-term data started to emerge, the system was already locked in. Food had been reformulated, habits had been formed. Schools were still teaching the food pyramid. Changing direction would require not just new research, but a willingness to admit that the previous direction had been set prematurely. That willingness didn't exist in any organized way. Individual researchers raised questions. Some studies contradicted the guidelines. But those contradictions didn't change policy. They didn't change what was taught in schools or what appeared on grocery store shelves. The momentum of the original decision carried forward, even as evidence accumulated that it might have been wrong. This wasn't about individuals making poor choices. It was about a system that had defined what healthy meant and then built an entire infrastructure around that definition. Once that infrastructure was in place, changing it required more than just new information. It required dismantling and rebuilding, and that process was slow, resistant, and incomplete. People who questioned the low-fat guidelines were often dismissed. They were told they were going against science, even when they were citing science. They were told they were promoting dangerous ideas, even when the ideas they were promoting were older than the guidelines themselves. The system had decided what was true, and dissent from that truth was treated as irresponsible. But the system's definition of truth wasn't static. It had changed before, and it would change again. What was considered dangerous in one decade became acceptable in the next. Eggs were blamed, then exonerated. Coffee was a risk, then a benefit. Butter was replaced by margarine, then margarine was replaced by butter again. Each shift came with the same certainty that had accompanied the previous one. The low-fat era was one part of a larger pattern. It was a moment when institutions decided they needed to act, and they acted before they had the full picture. They acted because acting seemed better than waiting. They acted because the public expected guidance, and providing no guidance felt like a failure. But the guidance they provided wasn't neutral. It shaped the food supply. It shaped what people ate. It shaped how children understood nutrition. And because it came from trusted sources, Most people followed it without question. The effects of that guidance didn't appear immediately. They accumulated over years, over decades. By the time the consequences were visible, they were difficult to attribute to any single cause. Was it the low-fat diet? Was it the increase in sugar? Was it the shift away from whole foods? Was it the rise of processed foods that happened alongside the low-fat trend? The answer wasn't simple, and the system didn't handle complexity well. It preferred clear causes and clear solutions. It preferred to identify a problem and issue a directive. But nutrition doesn't work that way. Human metabolism doesn't work that way. The relationship between food and health is layered, contextual, and individual. The low-fat guidelines ignored that complexity. They treated the human body as a machine that responded predictably to inputs. They assumed that if fat was reduced, health would improve. They didn't account for what would replace fat. They didn't account for how the food industry would respond. They didn't account for the long-term behavioral changes that would follow. And because they didn't account for those things, the outcome wasn't what was predicted. The intention was to reduce heart disease. The result was a population that ate more sugar, more processed carbohydrates, more engineered foods, and saw rates of metabolic disease rise instead of fall. This wasn't a failure of individuals, it was a failure of a system that moved too quickly, with too much certainty, based on too little evidence. It was a system that prioritized consensus over caution, clarity over accuracy, and action over patience. The people who lived through this period didn't have access to the debates that were happening behind closed doors. They didn't see the studies that contradicted the guidelines. They didn't know that some of the researchers who contributed to the recommendations later expressed doubt about the conclusions that had been drawn. What they saw was the public message, and the public message was clear. Fat is bad, low fat is healthy, and following these guidelines will protect you. That message was printed, broadcast, and taught. It was reinforced by doctors, teachers, and government agencies. It became the default understanding of how to eat. By the time new research began to challenge that understanding, the damage had already been done, not just to individual health, but to the way people thought about food. The focus on nutrients over ingredients, on labels over quality, on guidelines over intuition, that focus persisted even after the specific guidelines began to change. The system had trained people to look for external validation of what was healthy, rather than trusting their own observations or traditions. It had trained them to ignore hunger signals, to count and restrict, to see food as a set of numbers rather than as nourishment. And that training didn't end when the guidelines were revised. It continued. New guidelines replaced old ones, but the underlying approach remained the same. The assumption was still that health could be engineered through dietary rules, that complexity could be reduced to simplicity, that one set of recommendations could work for everyone. The low-fat era was a clear example of what happens when that approach is applied at scale. It showed how quickly a population's eating habits can be reshaped. It showed how easily uncertainty can be packaged as certainty. It showed how long it takes for the effects of those changes to become visible, and how difficult it is to reverse course once the system is in motion. But this was only one example. The pattern didn't start with fat, and it didn't end there. Other nutrients were targeted. Other recommendations were issued with the same confidence. Other changes followed the same trajectory. Rapid implementation, widespread adoption, delayed consequences, reluctant reassessment. The system that produced the low-fat guidelines is still in place. It still operates on the assumption that it can define what healthy means, that it can issue universal recommendations, that it can reshape the food supply to match those recommendations. It still prioritizes clarity over complexity, action over caution, and consensus over debate. And the effects of that system are still unfolding. The decisions made decades ago are still shaping what people eat today, how they think about food, and what they teach their children. The infrastructure built around those decisions, the food products, the educational materials, the medical advice, persists even as the science continues to evolve. What replaced natural fats in the food supply didn't come with clear long-term testing. What was taught as healthy wasn't based on generations of observation. What became normal was the result of guidelines that were issued quickly, adopted widely, and questioned slowly. And similar decisions followed.